I'm excited to be joined today by three members of our politics team, James Barragán, Cassi, Pollock, and Matthew Watkins. James covered politics for the Dallas Morning News from 2017 until he joined the Tribune just a few weeks ago in the spring. He has reported on immigration, public safety, voting rights, and he has traveled on assignment to the U.S. Supreme Court and to Houston during Hurricane Harvey. Cassi covers state politics for the Tribune, where she started as a fellow. Her coverage includes legislative campaigns, the Texas Capitol, and the politics that happen in between. And Matthew is the managing editor of the news and politics for the Texas Tribune. Previously, he served as the Texas Tribune's politics editor and breaking news editor and wrote about higher education and the business of college sports. So everyone watching, if you have any questions for James, Cassi, or Matthew, please feel free to use the chat section at the bottom of your screen. And let's get started because, you know, we have a lot to talk about now that everything's over, but it's not over. So I'm going to start with you, Cassi. Can you give us an overview of how the session ended and some of the priority bills that failed to pass?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's pretty fair to say that things ended on a rather tense note. They usually do, but this one just felt particularly tense. The night before the legislature adjourned, sine die, House Democrats walked out of the chamber, and that ultimately led to the death of a really controversial but high priority bill of Republican leadership related to elections. And so that just is kind of how things ended. In the days leading up to that, we saw the death of a number of other Republican priorities, one that would have opened the door to a ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying, one related to transgender students being restricted to play high school sports. Anyway, I guess the last thing that I'll say on this is everyone gavelled out, with tension and whatnot, but also with the acknowledgement that we're going to be back, as everyone's been saying, sooner rather than later, to tackle things like redistricting and more recently this elections bill and some bail legislation, as well as a number of other priorities that will be named by Greg Abbott in the coming hours, days, weeks, who knows?
So, like you mentioned, it was not very common. So this is a question for everybody. How have GOP leaders responded to the dramatic end? I'm going to start with you, Matthew. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, they haven't been very happy. It's been a lot of frustration, a lot of finger pointing in a bunch of different ways. You know, you saw Governor Greg Abbott come out pretty soon after this happened, really actually before even the midnight deadline to get the bill passed, and said, we're calling a special session to bring these lawmakers back and to pass out this bill. And then pretty soon after that, the finger pointing started. You had Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, come up in the Senate and basically say, this is the House's fault. This is due to mismanagement by the speaker, essentially, is what he was saying. And then you had Governor Greg Abbott the next day coming out with a tweet saying that he's basically going to veto all the funding for the Texas legislature and kind of, ultimately defund an entire branch of government if they can't kind of get their act together and get this done. I think we're still waiting for a few details on this. And we are seeing that all three of the big three, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the House speaker, are all determined to kind of get back together and pass out this voting bill along with some of the other priorities, bail, taxpayer-funded lobbying, some of these other things. But in the meantime, they're also not particularly happy with themselves. Dade Phelan saying he doesn't really love the idea of Greg Abbott's veto threat. Dan Patrick pointing the finger at the House, and Greg Abbott kind of expressing his frustration with the legislature as a whole. So united on the policy goals, not necessarily united on the ways they are going to get there and whose fault it is that they're not there yet.
So James, since Matthew mentioned the veto, I know that you wrote about the veto recently. So can you tell me a little bit about how common that is, or, just can he do that?
It's not common at all. In fact, it's the first time in Texas history, according to the Texas Legislative Reference Library, that a governor has threatened to veto an entire article in the budget. And it brings up particularly important questions because it's really a separation of powers, the stuff that we learn about in high school civics classes and high school government classes, those three branches of government: judiciary, executive, and the legislative. And essentially what the governor here has threatened to do is defund the legislative branch. He hasn't said exactly how he's going to do it. This is sort of how the governor likes to roll out his threats. He says one big thing and then the details will follow later. So we have to wait for what the details will look like. But the fear, I think, among legislators is that in threatening to veto that article, it's not just the House Democratic lawmakers who are in trouble here. They're the ones that decided to walk out. They're the ones that decided to break the quorum. And so I think they're willing to take the hit. It's also not much of a hit for them. It's a $600 per month stipend for lawmakers. They don't get paid a whole lot of money, and then some per diems. It's not a lot of money. But the fear from lawmakers is that it's going to affect everybody, Republican lawmakers as well, their staff as well, even though Republican lawmakers, and not to mention the entire Senate, had nothing to do with the walkout. But it's not just the two houses of the two chambers of the legislative branch. It's also a bunch of support staff, the Texas Legislative Council, which helps analyze and draft bills, the Legislative Budget Board, which gives like the analysis and budget recommendation, the Legislative Reference Library, all these like support staff who are really the unheralded heroes of the legislature, who do a lot of the behind the scenes work. They're at risk of being defunded if he indeed does go through with vetoing the entire article. The caveat, again, we don't know what that veto is going to look like, but it is certainly unprecedented in Texas history, and it does bring up those questions about separation of powers.
So, Cassi, I know that you talked to, you recently wrote about the speaker's reaction. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
To Abbott's veto threat?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Phelan essentially echoed a lot of what James did here. Phelan said that he didn't think that constitutionally lawmakers could be barred from receiving that $600 per month paycheck. But that aside from that, his concerns really were related to the legislative agencies that James was talking about and to the staffers. Phelan made a point to, note that anybody living in Austin who works at the Capitol whose paycheck is in jeopardy because of this veto threat, should Abbott actually carry it out? Just affordability questions, right? People who have to rely on that paycheck for families and whatnot. So he said that, so he listed all those concerns, and he also said, hey, I get why the governor's frustrated. This elections bill died, more or less an 11th hour death in my chamber. I would be upset too. It was a priority for Republican leaders, but at the end of the day, I don't think that I have concerns with this should it actually happen.
And can I just jump in here to say that it is unusual, I guess, at the end of the last special session that Governor Abbott called. It was definitely Lieutenant Governor Patrick who was making the special session call. And it wasn't, anyone in the House supporting that call. They had done their job and pushed through the priority legislation of the governor. That's the thing. The governor usually doesn't lose. He picks his priority legislation very carefully. What does he think he can get passed? What has he already sort of worked behind the scenes, right? And I think for everybody in the GOP, the elections bill and bail reform in one way or another were good things to pass. And so the governor really doesn't get upset until that last day of the penultimate day of the session, when all of a sudden the Democrats pull off this sort of last resort legislative tactic and are able to kill both of those bills. I don't think the governor was upset up until, correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew or Cassie, how you guys remember it. I think he was pretty on board with we're having one of the most conservative sessions in history up until that moment. So I think that's what really has caused up the ruckus at the end there, that his priority bills went down. It's not so much about the lieutenant governor's priorities. I think they were fine with some of those dying, even though they wouldn't say that out loud, but it's really the governor's priorities.
Yeah, I mean, I think go
ahead.
I think right up until the very end, right, we thought that there was a very good chance that both of those pieces of legislation can pass. I mean, I can just speak from experience. You and me, James, were putting together a story at 11 o'clock on Sunday night that was going to run the next morning. And then all of a sudden we were like, we have to completely rewrite this story. So yeah, I think the governor was pretty happy, and I think was thinking, going forward that he was going to have a all 5 of his, what they call his emergency items pass this session. It was going to be a very successful for him going into a primary season where he was probably going to face a challenge from his right. It's looking like he may face more than one challenge. And then all of a sudden, 2/5 of his priority legislation fall apart at the very last hour. And so, yeah, that had to have been very frustrating for him.
So, James, I have a follow-up for you related to that. Can you tell me a little bit about why Texas Democrats decided to walk out on Sunday night, and how effective is that strategy? I know that it stopped it for now, but I mean, how effective is that in the long run?
Well, it was certainly effective on Sunday night because if they had not walked out when they did, they would have had to vote on SB 7, the elections bill, and then probably on the bail reform bill after that, just because Republicans are so dominant in the legislature and in Texas government. They just have the numbers. It's a numbers game in politics, and they had the numbers. So it really is a last resort tactic, right? The last time we'd seen this happen was in 2003 when the Republicans were redrawing political maps in the state. And that was like a full month-long effort for House Democrats to leave at the end of the legislative session. This one, they just had to hold out for an hour and a half at the end there. But one lesson that we have learned from that 2003 walkout is that it took them 3 special sessions. During the regular session, the House Democrats left. During another one of the sessions, they were able to stall it tactically. And I think in the second special session, the Senate Democrats left. But eventually, Governor Perry called a 3rd special session, and they got those political maps redrawn, and that's what entrenched the GOP dominance in the state. So what we learned from there is that you can stall it, you can temporarily hold it off, but because they have the numbers, it's going to happen one way or another. For the Democrats, it's a small victory to go back to their voters and say, hey, look, we're fighting. We're pulling out all the stops. And I think what they're going to say in the next election cycle is, if you want us to do more, if you want us to change these things, you're going to have to put more Democrats in office. And so it is a temporary victory. The governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker have all said they want that elections bill on the table, and they're going to get it passed one way or another. And so that's sort of where we end up. I think we can all agree that we'll probably see something before the end of the year, probably before the end of the summer on the elections bill, but it's a temporary victory for Democrats. And it's successful for now, but we're all kind of waiting for that announcement of when that special session is going to come, and it has been promised.
Yeah, I would just say one other thing on that which is that there was the question, I think, among some Democrats about whether this was a good strategy or not. Will they just come back to the special session and maybe even pass a bill that they think is worse, right? And I think there were 2 things that happened here. One is they just made a decision that they couldn't sit idly by and watch this pass. That there was a desire, they felt so passionately about the subject that they needed to do something. But the other thing that we've seen since this happened was we saw some House members come out and say that one specific provision of the bill that was very offensive to Democrats, this Sunday voting limitation, which would have limited Sunday voting from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m. And that was very upsetting to many Democrats who point to the souls to the polls efforts. A lot of churches, especially Black churches, that, after church, they go and they get people to the polls. And there's a feeling that helps Democrats. And also, helps enfranchise African American voters. And one thing that we've seen since, that walkout is some members of the House say that was a drafting error, and they meant to put in 11 a.m. as the limit, 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. as opposed to 1 p.m. There's some skepticism about whether that was true, because we had members of the Senate in particular defending that provision on the Senate floor. But if that is indeed something that they are looking to fix, and they bump that back 2 hours, or move that up 2 hours, rather, if that is the only difference between the 2 bills, I think Democrats would consider that a victory to have gotten that version of the bill through, as opposed to the 1 p.m. to 9 p.m. bill. So, I mean, we'll see what happens. There's still a lot of legislating that needs to happen. But if that ends up being a result of this, I think that is a real substantive effect of the walkout.
One thing on SB 7 that I think is just worth noting, because I found it particularly interesting, was, we were dealing with Senate Bill 7, right? This huge piece of legislation. And in an interview with us the day after session, the Speaker Dade Phelan, made a point to say that he's never been a big fan of omnibus bills, that there can be drafting errors, or that, et cetera, et cetera. And so that he was he was effectively pushing for trying to take a more piecemeal approach. Hey, let's do this in multiple pieces of legislation. That way members can better vet the bills and we can do this one piece at a time. We really haven't seen that sort of response yet, or we haven't seen Abbott or Patrick indicate that they would support taking that different type of approach. But, that to me indicates that that's more along the lines of where the House is going to be, or at least what the House's starting point is going to be whenever we do have a special on this.
And one final thing on that, just to piggyback off of Cassie's point about like why the speaker and other lawmakers really don't like omnibus bills, is that they could be sunk like on the floor, right? And I think the speaker said in another interview, on a TV interview, that they had identified 12 points of order on that bill. And so that speaks to like how difficult it is to pass such a big omnibus bill with like, dozens of pages long, because that just gives the Democrats more opportunity to poke holes in it and kill it. And then one final thing I'll say is, there have been a lot of stories about the Democrats and walking out and who planned that and who was for it and who was against it. One thing that they told us on Sunday night after the walkout had happened was that there was a lot of good, and I think the speaker has said this to you as well, Cassie, there was a lot of good legislation and Democratic legislation that they liked that was still on the table, including like, a study on brains and something like that. But the Democrats, from my understanding, what I've been told is they were holding out on a Representative Cortez bill to expand healthcare for children, which was, I think, HB 290, that was put in as an amendment to one of the Senate bills that Sunday night. And that's why some of the Democrats weren't full on board with leaving. They were sort of holding out so they could pass that bill, is what I've heard. And then they walked out.
So, Matthew, I have a question for you. Since we've all been talking about the possibility of a special session, can you overview how does a special session work for everyone who's watching? When could it happen, and what might be addressed in one or more than one special sessions?
Sure. So the special session is definitely different than the regular legislative session. It can only be called by the governor, which is a key thing, right? So the governor decides when it is and what's on the docket, right? In a regular session, you can basically take up any issue. In the special session, you can't pass out legislation that isn't kind of set up as an item for the special session by the governor. So he has a lot more control here. There's also fewer of the kind of deadlines that Democrats can work and use as leverage to kind of kill bills. That makes it a little bit harder for them to obstruct as members of the minority party. In terms of timing, we don't really know. I think all of us are sitting here just hoping that it's not during our already scheduled vacations. And, Governor Abbott, there is definitely going to be a special session on redistricting, right? And that is that has to be in the fall, because there's some information that we still need from the census in order for that redistricting to happen. On top of that, though, it sounds like what Governor Abbott has signaled is that he's going to do a second session sometime in the summer. We have less information as to when that will be. Maybe July, but who knows? When he did this last time, the last special session that we did, he gave us Cassie, like a month notice, basically, where he came out, gave a press conference and said, we're having a special session, this will be the date, and these are all the items. And it was this kind of laundry list of items, many of them very conservative items that he wanted them to pass. So I would expect, my guess would be that he will do something along those lines, in the next month or so, laying out kind of how these special sessions are going to work.
If I can chime in here about the last special session in 2017, that was, I think, in August. And one of the items on that was, for those of you following along at home, mail ballot fraud. We had fixed it in 2017, but here we are again, a more election fraud legislation. And then the other thing I wanted to say, for those of you who want to put on your tinfoil hats or, I don't know, do your math, is that the fiscal year ends August 31st, right? So we're talking about, earlier defunding the legislative branch. Those like thousands of employees in the legislative branch are guaranteed to be paid through August 31st. After August 31st, beginning in September, they will not be paid if he follows through on that. So I think from what I've heard from people reporting that story is like that's factoring into the decision. It will likely be before that August 31st, because otherwise you're really putting that hurt on those employees in September. They're not getting paid. They're not coming to work. The lawmakers aren't getting that stuff. So if you do it in July or August, you at least hold the threat over them and give the lawmakers the ability change their fate, I guess. So something to factor in there.
Yeah, and one other thing to note, which is that the governor has 20 days to veto a bill right at the end of the session. And so we should know pretty soon, within that range, whether or not he's going to veto the legislative appropriations and things like that. And the assumption is that there will be some kind of, once that step happens, if that step does indeed happen, we'll have a better idea of how the rest of this will play out beyond there. Part of this is an expectation that there should be some leverage here, right? If he vetoes it, he can put it on the special session docket to call it, but he could hold that back until they take the actions that he wants them to on various other things, whether that's voting, bail, or anything else.
So I know we've been talking a lot about the SB 7, but there were also other big things that were happening. One of them was just bills related to the pandemic. So Cassi, I know there were several bills filed related to that. So can you talk me through what actually happened, what got passed, and what didn't that people thought might pass?
Yeah. So the big legislation, at least on the House side of the session, was House Bill 3, designated a priority for the Speaker, hence the low bill number. And that was another omnibus bill, talking about omnibus bills a lot today, that would have essentially, as passed by the House, would have aimed to curb the governor's powers during emergency powers during pandemics. It would have created this legislative oversight board. It would have required the governor to call a special legislative session if he wanted to issue executive orders relating to masks or limiting business capacity. Long story short, though, is that the Senate did not agree with that approach. They had their own vision for how to respond to disasters, how the state should respond to disasters. And the proposals that the upper chamber rallied around would have applied more broadly to disaster declarations in general. And it would have required the governor to order special sessions pretty much, we're talking hurricanes, tornadoes, whenever a disaster declaration has been ordered by the governor. The legislature would have had to come to town. So needless to say, that bill did not make it anywhere this session. Unclear whether the governor or lawmakers in general have an appetite to try to re-tackle that issue in a special session. The Speaker made pretty clear in his interview with us earlier this week that those two different approaches aren't really going to change, that it's going to remain a big sticking point. So we'll see if anything on that ends up making any headway. And then just in terms of legislation that did pass, I'm just going to rattle off some bills that the Trib's Karen Brooks Harper wrote about earlier this week. They passed legislation to prohibit so-called vaccine passports, to ban the mandatory closure of churches and gun stores during emergency declarations. And then they also passed legislation that allows visitation to long-term care facilities during emergencies, and it lets the sick and dying have one visitor with them in those final days. So, of course, just broadly, there's like a glimpse at what the legislature did pass in terms of a response to the pandemic.
So, James, another issue that was widely discussed this session was policing and addressing police brutality. So what bills related to policing passed and what didn't make it?
Yeah, I think there was a big hope in the beginning for criminal justice changes, just given the year we'd had with George Floyd in Minneapolis. George Floyd, of course, grew up in Houston, and lawmakers across the aisle had said we should do something. The Speaker had said he was for some criminal justice reforms. The governor had at some point indicated that he'd be in favor of naming some law the George Floyd Act. There was indeed a George Floyd Act, and that was an omnibus bill that covered a lot of these police reforms that did not move much at all. There were a bunch of other smaller pieces of that. I think to in the teaching of it, say chokeholds are not allowed, like the kind of chokeholds that George Floyd eventually died because of. So there was small bills in terms of that stuff, but I don't think, and Cassie and Matthew, you all can sort of chime in here. I don't think that there was actually any big ticket item that people can say this was a huge criminal justice reform. A bunch of little small things, including, the Speaker had a whole package of bills, but even that package had mixed level of success.
Yeah, I think the George Floyd Act was definitely the big ticket item, particularly among the legislative Black caucus, and did not make it through. And as James said, there were some more incremental things, no-knock warrants, limiting when those can be used, things like that, who can sign a no-knock warrant, and things like that. But the big ticket items, did not make it through.
So Matthew, I have a question for you. Now that the session's over, does Abbott have to sign every single bill that he has on his desk that he's not going to veto, or do they pass without his signature? How does that work?
Yeah, so if he does not sign a bill after a certain period of time, that bill will become law. I believe that's 20 days at the end of the session. If it was a bill that passed earlier, it's 10 days. He will certainly veto bills. He always does. There's usually a surprise or two in there. And then the other big thing that we're really watching for is, as we've already discussed, the budget, which Abbott has a line item veto in, which is what allows him to veto basically just the funding for the legislature. But he usually finds a couple other things in there that he, crosses out as well. So, I know there's been at least one veto already, but it was a bill that the author had asked him to veto because there was a better version making its way through the legislative session. And so we haven't really seen kind of the full effect yet. Of course, most of the bills that pass through, the big ticket items, are things that he has supported or already indicated that he will sign.
So this is the last question for everyone. And I'm going to start with you, Cassi. Just in general, what are each of you most interested in watching regarding what happens in the legislature in the next few weeks?
A big thing for me is timing. Of course, we have another election cycle that has already started. And of course, elected officials are going to try to, call for various items to be added to the special session agenda in order to better fit the year, any ambitions they may have for running for higher office. So, I think that one interesting thing that's, and knock on wood here, just in terms of having a slow news afternoon, but we haven't seen any retirement announcements yet from the legislature. Is that because of redistricting on the horizon, as well as this other special session? I know that there have been, that the rumor mill has been chock full of names of senators and House members who may want to run for statewide office, but are maybe holding off from announcing that just yet until there's more details on a special session. So all of that posturing is very interesting to me, at least, and that is what I will be personally trying to keep tabs on here in the next few days.
What about you, James?
Well, I think along with the scheduling, I'm interested in seeing what are the other items. We know that there's bail reform, we know that there's elections, but what are going to be the other items? The lieutenant governor has asked for, the restrictions on transgender student athletes, the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying, and the social media moderation bills to be on there. Those were the lieutenant governor's priorities, and those are really considered more quote unquote red meat items from the far right of the Republican Party. Abbott has said he supports those, but he has not been as vocal about them as the lieutenant governor. So I'm wondering, are those going to make it on there? Are there some other issues? The speaker had said, there's stuff to do on securitization and on the grid. And stuff like that. So just kind of wondering what else is going to be on there, because that can really dictate how the special session goes.
And last but not least, Matthew, what are you looking forward to?
Sure, I'm really looking at how far each side, each party is interested in pushing, going into what is going to probably be a contentious summer and fall, right? We mentioned Abbott already. He's facing already one primary challenge from former state senator Don Huffines. There are indications that Sid Miller, the agriculture commissioner, might be interested in joining the race. Alan West announced he's resigning as chair of the Texas GOP today. Some could see that as a precursor for him getting into a race for governor. So how much is Abbott going to be watching kind of his right and making sure that he's, shored up in a Republican primary? And then on the other hand, Democrats who walked out, took a dramatic measure to block this bill, how much farther are they willing to go? I mean, are they going to show up for these special sessions? Are they going to do this again in any way? We talked about in 2003 how they left the state. Is there anything that matter we want to go. I mean, we know where each party's positions are on these issues. The question is, how far are they willing to take these fights, and how dramatic are they willing to be, which could really tell the difference between, a fairly simple session where a few bills get passed out, or, a prolonged and ugly fight between, two sides that are definitely not on the same page in terms of policy.
Well, thank you guys. With that, we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to our last episode. And I want to thank you, James, Cassie, Matthew, for joining us today and explaining these complicated topics and this complicated session, more complicated than we thought it was going to be toward the end. So for more coverage, you can get the latest and most important Texas news at texastribune.org. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And again, you can go see all of our other episodes on our IG Live TV tab on our Instagram account. And have a good Friday, everyone. Thank you so much.
Enjoy the weekend.
Bye.
Bye.